We covered the things that are on the board behind me. We're talking generally about our efforts to build as opposed to allowing God to build through us. We looked at Babel, we looked at Abraham, we looked at Daniel's dream in chapter 2 and Daniel's interpretation of the dream in chapter 4. We looked at God's provided city that is discussed in Revelation 21 and talked about at other places in the Scriptures. We know that Abraham was looking forward to that city that was built by God. We know that God has the build, or as he says in Psalm 127, those that build labor in vain. We've seen all of those things. We've seen that it doesn't even matter how great or how wealthy you become, it becomes vain. We looked at Luke 12, which I think is the rich young ruler. He was powerful, he was influential, he was wealthy. Didn't matter. We looked at, actually that's not Luke 12. Luke 12 I think is the one who built the greater barns because he had much, and he said he could sit back and relax because he had much goods and he had many years to live at ease. And that very night, God required his soul. Doesn't matter how wealthy we are. It doesn't matter how great the things that we build are. And man can certainly build great things. He made that clear at the time of Babel in Genesis 11. He said that without him interfering, nothing would be impossible that man set his heart to do. And so he went down there to confuse their language so that they could no longer continue the work that they were doing. And so we can build just amazing things, but it doesn't matter how impressive it is, it will not last. And it can be brought low by God. This applies to us at any level. Whether we're talking about an individual building his life, whether we're talking about a household that is being built, whether we are talking about churches, whether we are talking about cities, or whether we are talking about nations, it doesn't matter. Without God and without following his will, we make ourselves actually enemies of God. That's one of the points of the story of the Tower of Babel, is when we strike out to accomplish our own purposes, to try to build for ourselves things, to try to make a name for ourselves and make ourselves great, we make ourselves enemies of God. And that is not somewhere that, it's not somewhere that anyone should want to be. There's a long history of God bringing down such works. Babel is one of the first examples. He acted in the days of Noah as well, didn't he? He came down and destroyed the whole earth, save 8 souls, to put an end to the things that were being done. He acted in history with Babylon. He acted with the nation of Assyria. He acted with the Medes and the Persians. He acted with Rome. He acted with Jerusalem itself, his own chosen people. He brought to nothing. And by the way, Jerusalem as it's presented in the Bible still doesn't exist to this day. There's a nation that's called Israel, and there is a city called Jerusalem. But who's the high priest? Who are the Levites? How can they worship? Where's the temple? Where's the ark? Where's all of the implements of the temple that are required for them to offer their worship to God? All of those things are gone. They can't do what they did anymore. The Israel that exists today is not the Israel that God raised up and protected and provided for, because he brought them low because of their arrogance and because They set out to do their own will over and over and over again. And where we kind of ended things last week was reminding ourselves of what God tells us in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 30 and 31. We know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," and again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. We should always be mindful that when we make ourselves enemies of God, we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. But if we want to look at the other side of the coin, which I always like to do, let's look at Romans chapter 8 and verse 31, where it simply, well, this isn't necessarily the whole of the context of the verse, but these words, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" But what is, well, I'll ask it this way. Does that provide any comfort for you? To know that if God is for us, that there's not really anybody out there that can stand against us? And if it does provide comfort for you, what exactly does it mean if God is with you? Who can be against you? Or who can be against us? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Oh, come on, you got to have some thoughts on that. Does it mean that nothing bad is going to befall us? Nope, doesn't mean that. So we know that that's not what it's saying. So what is it saying then? Is it saying that everything that we set our hearts to do, we're going to accomplish? Now raise your hand if you've ever been disappointed. I've been disappointed a lot. I have all kind of grand ideas. I set out to do them. I'm not always successful. Does that mean that God isn't with me because I'm not always successful? No. So what does it mean if God is for us, who can be against us? By the way, we're going to talk about this, I think, a little bit more in Sunday night's sermon. Cheap advertisement for Sunday night sermon. What does it mean? Does it mean that we shouldn't fear the things that do befall us? See, what I read when I read this is, I guess, best explained in practical terms through what Paul wrote about when he said, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. I've learned how to both have an abundance and to be in want." What is Paul talking about? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's where that line of reasoning ends. What Paul is talking about is it doesn't really matter what happens, and it doesn't really matter who our enemies are. If we remain faithful to God, we can have every bit of confidence and trust of what? That he is faithful and just to do exactly what he said he would do. What is the end of someone who walks righteously with God? Okay, we're going to go be with him. That's the end of someone who walks. Does that mean that path that gets us there is going to be without trouble? No, it doesn't mean that at all. You can look at Paul's life and see that it doesn't mean that. He had all kinds of terrible things happen to him, all kinds of terrible things done to him. How long was Jesus alive on the earth? Take a rough estimate. About 33, 34 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's a relatively short life, isn't it? By anybody's standards, that's a relatively short life. How did his life end again? They beat him severely, nailed him to a cross, and left him to die. Sure. Okay. That's true. Another Another way of expressing if God is for us, who can be against us, I think, is what Jesus taught when he said, do not fear those who kill the body, but rather fear the one who kills or destroys both body and soul. If God is with us, who do we have to fear? Is there anyone else who can destroy both body and soul? See, he's the only one I need to worry about. Because my enemies can't destroy my soul. Only God has power over my soul. That is correct. We do know that. Does it always feel that way? If you think it does, you need to go back and read the book of Job again. He didn't feel like everything was good. And yet, God allowed these things to take place, and he had a purpose for them. And he was working toward Job's good and all mankind's good. Again, to bring Jesus up. Was the way that Jesus was treated, would we call that good? No. But did it work for good purposes? So even when people do bad, and by the way, that's what Joseph told his brothers too, right? What you meant for evil, God used for good. You sold me into slavery to harm me, but God used those circumstances to actually save you. I'm where I am today and able to provide for you as the end of an action that you started for evil purposes. And so we need to understand that what this is ultimately saying is the biggest issue we have is our relationship with God. Now look at Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 16. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 16. There's a series of conditional statements made. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I commanded you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering in to take possession of it. The whole story of Israel, from its conception all the way through to it being, actually, if you can really take the whole story of Israel, and it could apply to anyone, could be an allegory of anyone's life. Hopefully people will learn from that story and not make the mistake that the Israelites made, right? And fall away from God and end up being destroyed by him. But that whole picture of being delivered out of slavery because we cried for God, he comes to our aid. He delivers us. We've studied about that in the Sunday morning class. He delivered us. As Israel, how did they get delivered from Egypt? What was the actual thing that separated them from the Egyptians? Anybody remember? Passing through the Red Sea. When they passed through the Red Sea, God made a way for them to get through. They passed through the sea. What happened to the Egyptians? They were cut off and destroyed. There's the separation between Israel and their Egyptian bondage. Even when it came back, passing through the sea. And that has important imagery to it. How did they get into the promised land? Anybody remember? They stood on one side of the Jordan River. They crossed over into the promised land on the other side of the Jordan River. What happened? The guys who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, as soon as their feet hit the water, what happened to the Jordan River? All of the water stopped and it all piled up on one side. They walked across on dry ground. When the ark passed through, the waters resumed. Both when they left their captivity, when they entered into their promise, it was through water. That wasn't by accident. He's teaching us. When we get deliverance from the bondage that we have to sin, are we in the promised land yet? Nope. We have to go traverse the wilderness, follow God's commandments. By the way, how are they going through the wilderness? They didn't take necessarily the easiest route all the time, but how did they know where to go and when to go? God appeared to them as a column of fire in the day, a cloud in the day and fire by night. And he said, when I move, you move. When I stop, you stop. If I stop, you set up the camp and you stay there until I move. You go the direction that I go, you follow me. They actually got across the land pretty quickly, and then he said what? Go over there and go to war and take the land. I've given it to you. And that generation said what? Oh, they're really big, and we're like grasshoppers in their sight, and that's not going to work. And so they ended up wandering around aimlessly for 40 years in the wilderness and dying in the wilderness, never having received the promise. That can be our lives. We can wander around aimlessly, not following God's commands, not doing what he tells us to do, being afraid to follow his commandments fully, and die in the wilderness apart from the blessings of God. Or we can be like Joshua's generation, who actually crossed over, who actually went to war. By the way, when they crossed over the Jordan and they entered the promised land, was their fight over? Was their life over? Was their trip over? No, they spent years battling and fighting and striving. But as long as they were doing what God would have them do, God was with them, and they accomplished the purposes that God had set out for them, right? They won their battles. They took the land. They inherited the promises as long as they did what God told them. What happened when they quit doing what God told them to do? Yes, sir. What they said was, have you brought us out here to die? Is that why we were delivered from Egypt, so we could come out here in the wilderness and die? Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. And there's a very valuable lesson in that statement alone. Those difficulties that we go through, those things that God allows to happen, those trials, those tribulations, those are testing. Those are the things that refine us, that develop our faith, that strengthen our faith, that make our resolve as they ought to be. If we continue, if we don't lose sight of God, if we continue to walk in his ways, if we survive the test. What happens if we quit, though? How many times does he warn us, do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due time you'll reap if you don't grow weary. Don't stop just because it's hard. Don't stop just because it's not turning out the way that you think it ought to. Don't stop just because you don't understand why God would let this happen. Learn every lesson that you can. Be dedicated. Pursue what is right. And the promise is, in the end, you'll receive a crown of righteousness. Revelation 2:10 puts it like this: be faithful even unto death. And I believe that the force of what's being said there is not really be faithful until you die, although I think that's a true statement. I don't think that's the force of Revelation 2:10. Be faithful even unto death means even if you have to die to be faithful. Be faithful even to death, and you will receive a crown of righteousness. And so that's what he's talking about here in Deuteronomy 30 and 16 when he says, if you obey the commandments of the Lord, if you love the Lord. Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you keep the commandments, the things that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, he's basically said the same thing 5 different times in different ways. If you'll do what I told you to do, I will bless you. Are we willing to do what he told us to do? Are we willing to build what he tells us to build? Yes, sir. No, that's okay. Go ahead. Right. It does come together. And what Jesus did and accomplished in his temptation in Matthew 4 is an example of what that's talking about. After 40 days of not eating, he was hungry. And the test was what? Turn these stones to bread. What was Jesus' response to that? It's not about whether I'm hungry or not. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. That's what's most important. Did the people of Babel believe that they had to live by every word that proceeded out of the mouth of God? No, because they were building for themselves and making for themselves a name and doing the exact opposite of what God had told them to do, which was be fruitful and fill the earth. Their whole point was, let's make a great city where none of us have to leave. Where we can always find it, we can always come back, we can always be protected. Let's make a place for ourselves where we can be safe and we can be happy. And they were excluding God. What about the days of Noah? What had they done? They had excluded God. They were only doing evil continually. Even their thoughts were constantly on evil. What about the nation of Babylon? Were they servants of God? That's kind of a loaded question. At times, they were used by God to do things, but were they serving God in the sense of them making the determination that they're going to walk after the commandments of God and be righteous and godly? And the answer is no. And so when their cup was full and overflowing, what did God do to the nation of Babylon? It's a wasteland. Same with Assyria and the Medes and the Persians. The same with Rome. Look, Rome controlled practically the whole world at its zenith. From the Netherlands, parts of North Europe, all the way down to Italy, and then on the other side of the sea of the Mediterranean, into North Africa. They were spread all over the earth. Where are they at today? Now, I understand there's a nation called Italy, but is it the Empire of Rome? The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. There's a book by that title. That empire fell. And to get into modern times, we can think about folks like Great Britain, whom it once was said the sun never set on the kingdom of Great Britain. They had holdings throughout the entire earth. Do they still have that kind of power and influence? And a bunch of ragtag farmers from one of their colonies managed to defend themselves and gain their independence and rise up to be what is thought by most people today the greatest nation in the world. We're certainly wealthy and powerful, and people fear us, and people long to live here, and there's a lot of good about this nation. But if we don't consider God, if we make for ourselves a name and build for ourselves a nation and put our faith and confidence in ourselves and exclude God, there's going to be a point in time where God does what? The same thing He did to all the rest of them. And that is true at every single level, no matter what you apply it to. No matter what you apply it to. If we don't pursue the commandments of the Lord with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, if we don't love God, we make ourselves an enemy of God. And that is, you don't poke a grizzly. There's a reason you don't poke a grizzly. He's bigger, he's stronger, and he's faster than you. Look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 8 with me. Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 8. The scriptures say, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding." Now, do you see how that fits with exactly what we're talking about? Going all the way back to our first illustration, the people of Babel. Let us build for ourselves a city. Let us make for ourselves a name. They were leaning upon their own understanding. They were deciding for themselves what they ought to do, and they were doing it alone. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him. Who is Him in that context? God. In all your ways, everything that you do, acknowledge God. He will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Do we believe that? I'm going to tell you something before you nod your head and say yes. If I believe that, do you know what that means about the way I live my life? It means that the statement, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me," can be seen, not heard. Do you know what I mean by that? That it can be seen? That other people who watch me live, who listen to me speak, who otherwise may not know me, but just watch and see me, can say, wait a minute, he's living just like Jesus lived. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. That's what it means to trust in the Lord with all your heart and to not lean on your own understanding, and in all your ways acknowledge Him. That's what Jesus did. And it didn't always look like it was turning out good. Sometimes the crowds were growing around Jesus, and sometimes He told those crowds the truth, and what happened to those crowds? They deserted Him. And other times He told those crowds the truth, and what happened to those crowds? They went from screaming, "Make Him a king," to screaming, "Crucify Him." He was following God every step of the way. So can we look at how the world reacts to us to determine whether or not we're following God? Can we look at our success to determine whether or not we're following God? How big was Jesus' church? He had one of those big mega churches? Millions and millions of dollars worth of real estate? Didn't have jet planes back then, so the nicest chariots, gilded with gold, the finest horses from Arabia. Did he have scores and scores and scores of people serving him and waiting on him? No, you know what he did? He wrapped a towel around his waist and got down on his hands and knees and washed his disciples' feet. Rather than having scores and scores of people treating him like a king, he was behaving as a servant. If you judge, how many books did he write and publish? Oh, yeah, there's not any, is there? How much money did he make? That's the way we judge success, right? He didn't do any of it, but you know what? Every step, every single step that he took, every word out of his mouth was him doing the will of God at all times. And he was a success because he was doing the will of God. And God exalted him at the proper time. Who else has ascended into heaven to sit at the right hand of the throne of God? Who else is reigning over the kingdom of God? In who else can we find salvation? Give you a hint. Read Acts chapter 4. You'll find out in no one else. For there is salvation in no one else. For there's no other name given on earth among men by which we must be saved. And so, sometimes it's not going to look successful by the ways that the world judges success. Sometimes it's not going to be easy. He was rejected. He was beaten. He was spat upon. He was abused. He was crucified. So how was he healed, and how did he get refreshments to his bones? Really, he died, right? And he went to the grave. 3 days later, they went back to anoint that body with oil. They couldn't do that because they were in such a rush on the day before the Sabbath. They were not allowed to work on the Sabbath, so they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath. Early on the first day of the week, they run down before the light of the sun had really struck the earth. They run down to the tomb, and what do they find? It's empty. 40 days later, his disciples stood and watched him ascend into heaven. See, he wasn't left in that state. He was raised. He was glorified. He was exalted. And he went to be with the Father. And when you think about that story, it's with that in mind that you need to go back and read John 14 when he says, I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. This isn't a promise about ease of life. This is a promise about a successful life. And that we will be healed with God, but we need to wait on him and let him do it at the proper time. Not to seek our own exaltation, but allow God to exalt us at the proper time. When it's proper, we'll be rewarded. We'll be recognized, and we'll benefit from the blessings of God. One more passage, and then we'll wrap it up because I ain't got much time left. James chapter 4, verses 8, 9, and 10. This one actually introduces some of the ideas of the hardship and the spiritual discipline that we have to apply to ourselves in order to fulfill these commandments. James 4, starting in verse 8, draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. What if I don't draw near to God? Is He going to draw near to me if I refuse to draw near to Him? No. If I go through this life making my own way, then I'm alone. Draw near to God, and He'll draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. That's what it means to put your confidence in God and walk with Him and let Him build rather than you try to build. We got to stop. I'm out of time. We'll pick this up, Lord willing, next week. And we're going to talk. I'll go ahead and tell you, and you can prepare your minds. You're welcome, Miss Sheila. About falling into the trap of making ourselves out to be God. We need to not fall into that trap, and people have continually fallen into that trap historically.